He thought it was just a wounded horse at his fence. But when Jack Mercer touched the animal's scarred back, everything he had buried, the fire, the guilt, the silence, rose again. The horse refused food, refused rest, and stared only at the mountains. Against his will, Jack followed, stepping into a wilderness where a faded green door, a forgotten journal, and one impossible choice would change not just his farm, but his entire life. The morning in Wallowa Valley broke with a chill that felt older than the mountains themselves. Jack Mercer stepped out of his farmhouse, his boots sinking into the damp earth left behind by the night's drizzle. The air smelled of alfalfa and wet wood, and the barn roof still carried beads of rain that slid down like silver threads. Jack was used to mornings like this, quiet, gray, with nothing but the distant hum of Union Pacific freight trains echoing across the fields. But this morning was different. By the fence line, half hidden in the mist, stood a horse Jack had never seen before. Its coat was a deep, earthy brown, soaked to a darker sheen by the rain. On its shoulder, a shallow gash oozed with dried blood, and along its back stretched a streak of dampness that looked like a scar carved by storms, a rain mark that caught the faint light of dawn. The animal trembled but did not run, its eyes following Jack with an intensity that seemed both desperate and defiant. Jack froze. It had been years since he'd gone near a horse, not since the fire that had taken his younger brother. That night still haunted him, the smell of smoke, the orange glow devouring the sky, the cry he never answered in time. Horses had been his brother's passion, not his. And yet here stood one now, bleeding, alone, as if the past itself had wandered out of the fog to confront him. He muttered, almost to himself, "You picked the wrong place, boy." But the horse didn't flinch. Instead, it shifted one step closer, breath steaming in the cool air. The sound it made wasn't the sharp, frightened snort of a wild mustang. It was softer, like a plea. Jack's hand twitched at his side. He didn't want this. He had work to do, bills to pay, a farm that barely held together against the weight of drought and falling crop prices. Yet the image of his brother's eyes, wide and trusting, rose unbidden in his mind. From the porch, Maya's voice broke the silence. "Dad? What's going on?" His daughter's hair was tied up messily, her jacket too thin for the cold, but her gaze locked instantly on the horse. She gasped. "He's hurt." Jack turned toward her, intending to wave her back inside, but she was already jogging toward the fence. The horse didn't shy away. Instead, it lowered its head as Maya approached, nostrils flaring at her outstretched hand. Jack's chest tightened. There was something in that stillness, in the way the animal allowed her touch, that he couldn't ignore. "Careful," he warned. His voice came out harsher than intended. Maya glanced at him, then back at the horse, stroking its damp neck. "He's scared, Dad. Not dangerous." Jack stepped closer, despite himself. The animal's wound wasn't life-threatening, but needed cleaning. His years on the farm had taught him enough about treating livestock, though he hadn't wanted to lay a hand on a horse in decades. Now, standing within reach, he saw more details. The mud-caked hooves, the faint imprint of a halter long gone, the wild yet searching eyes. This wasn't a wild horse at all. Someone had cared for it once. Someone had left it behind. Jack sighed, pulling a pair of gloves from his pocket. "Fine," he said, more to himself than to Maya. "But we can't keep him. He'll need patching up, and then he's gone." Maya smiled faintly, relief softening her features. "We'll call him Rainmark," she whispered, fingers tracing the streak across his back. The horse flicked an ear at the sound, as though recognizing the name. Jack worked in silence, cleaning the wound with iodine, binding it with steady hands that remembered the motions even after all these years. Rainmark shifted once, but didn't resist, standing as if he knew this stranger was the only chance he had. Each movement drew Jack deeper into memories he thought he'd buried. The smell of hay in his brother's hair, the echo of laughter in the barn. He clenched his jaw, finishing the bandage quickly. When he stepped back, Rainmark lifted his head, eyes fixed not on the farm, but toward the distant silhouette of the Eagle Cap Mountains. His whole body leaned that way, taut as a bowstring, like he was listening to a call only he could hear. Jack frowned, following the gaze into the mist. Maya spoke softly, almost afraid to break the spell. "He's not lost, Dad. He's trying to go somewhere." Jack didn't answer. The mountains loomed silent, ancient, holding secrets he had no intention of chasing. And yet, as Rainmark's breath steamed in the gray morning, Jack felt the ground shift beneath him, as though the horse's arrival had cracked open something long dormant. He pulled his hat lower, muttered, "Let's get him to the barn," and led Rainmark toward shelter. But in his chest, a thought he didn't want to face stirred like a spark in old ashes. Maybe the horse hadn't chosen this place by accident. The barn smelled of hay and iron, a scent Jack hadn't let himself breathe in deeply for years. He led Rainmark into the empty stall at the far end, where dust motes floated in pale strips of sunlight. The horse stood quiet, though its eyes kept drifting toward the open side door that looked out toward the mountains. Jack noticed the way its ears twitched at every distant sound, as if measuring whether it could run again. He shut the door firmly. "You'll stay put tonight," he muttered. His voice carried the tone of a man trying to convince himself, not just the animal. Maya appeared with a bucket of water, her cheeks flushed pink from the chill. She set it down carefully and reached up to scratch the horse's neck. Rainmark leaned into her touch, closing its eyes for a brief moment of peace. Jack felt a tug inside, something between jealousy and longing. His daughter had a gift he didn't. She was able to trust without hesitation, to love without condition. At dinner, the kitchen felt too small, the wood stove clicking as it cooled. Maya spoke with excitement about the horse, about how its eyes followed her, about the way it seemed to know things. Jack pushed his plate away, appetite gone. "Don't get attached," he said. "He's not ours. Someone will come looking." Maya frowned. What if no one does? What if he's meant to be here? Jack's spoon clattered against the table. Meant to be? He shook his head. You think life works like that? Animals don't show up with some grand plan. They wander, they get hurt, and we— He stopped himself, staring at the knot in the table's wood grain. The silence stretched. Maya's eyes softened. You never talk about Uncle Sam, she whispered. Jack stiffened. The old fracture inside him throbbed like a bone that never healed right. He could see it again. The wall of fire, the sound of crackling timber. His brother's shout swallowed by smoke. He had chosen to haul water to protect the neighbors' barns instead of rushing back into the flames. By the time he returned, the house was gone. His brother was gone. And with him went every ounce of joy Jack once felt around horses, the creatures Sam had loved more than anything. He rose abruptly, grabbing his coat. I'll check the fences. He left the house, the cold air biting harder than before. In the barn, Rainmark lifted its head at his approach. The horse's gaze was steady, almost uncomfortably knowing. Jack leaned against the stall door, arms folded, the weight of memory pressing down. "You don't belong here," he whispered to the horse. "And neither do I. Not anymore." Rainmark shifted, hooves scuffing straw, but its eyes never left him. Jack felt the strange pull again, like the animal saw straight through the walls he'd built. He turned away, unwilling to let it burrow deeper. Later that night, sleep refused to come. He walked the farmhouse hallway, pausing at framed photos, his late wife smiling with sunflowers in her hair, young Maya atop a pony led by her uncle, his own younger face unlined by grief. He touched the glass, then drew back, as though burned. The old fracture inside was not just about loss. It was about guilt, the kind that seeps into marrow and won't let go. From outside came a soft sound. Not the restless shifting of livestock, but something sharper. A low whinny, drawn out, insistent. Jack went to the window. Rainmark stood in the paddock, not sleeping, not eating, but staring north toward the mountains under a sky scraped clean by stars. The horse's breath rose like smoke, its body taut as a wire pulled too tight. Jack felt the echo of it in his chest, that restless tug toward somewhere he didn't want to go. He gripped the window frame until his knuckles whitened. He had promised himself never again, never back to the life that cost him his brother. But here was this horse, with its rin-marked back and wounded shoulder, looking like it carried the burden of a mission bigger than both of them. Behind him, Maya's sleepy voice murmured, "Dad?" She stood in the hallway, wrapped in a blanket. "He's not just lost. He's looking for something." Jack didn't answer. He closed the curtain and turned away. Yet even as he lay down again, the image of Rainmark fixed on the mountains burned behind his eyes, pulling at the fracture that had never healed. Somewhere out there, past the ridgelines, lay not just wilderness, but something waiting to be found. He didn't want to believe it, but the horse seemed determined to make him. And so, as the night settled, Jack felt the old wound inside him stir, cracked open by a creature he hadn't asked for, and a direction he had no intention of following. Not yet. By the third morning, the rhythm of the farm felt unsettled. Jack moved through his chores, checking the alfalfa fields, clearing the irrigation ditch, fixing a section of wire fence. Yet his eyes kept drifting back toward the barn. Rainmark had been eating little, drinking less, and every time Jack checked, the horse stood at the same side window of the stall, neck stretched toward the ridges of the Eagle Cap wilderness, as though tethered by an invisible rope. Maya noticed, too. She leaned on the stall door, whispering to the horse like it was an old friend. "You're not sick," she said softly. "You're restless. You're trying to tell us something." The horse flicked an ear back, then pressed its head against the wood, and she laughed. To her, it was proof. To Jack, it was another complication. He found himself studying the paddock that evening, bootprints pressed into the thawing ground. Rainmark had worn a groove near the north fence, pacing in a perfect line, hooves tracking the same arc again and again. It wasn't random wandering. It was direction. He followed the trail with his eyes until it vanished into the tree line. Beyond those pines lay slopes too rugged for cattle and too remote for most hunters. But something in the horse's persistence gnawed at him. That night, Lila Torres drove up in her dented pickup, headlights sweeping across the gravel drive. She carried a box of medical supplies and a thermos of coffee. "Thought I'd check on your patient," she said. Her smile was brief, cautious, but her eyes lingered on Jack longer than necessary. In the barn, Lila listened to Rainmark's breathing with her stethoscope, ran a practiced hand down the scarred shoulder, then stood back. "Wounds are healing fine, but he's not resting." Maya seized the chance. "Because he's not supposed to be here. He keeps looking at the mountains, like he knows where he belongs." Jack shook his head. "Or he's just a horse that doesn't like stalls." Lila crouched, touching the coarse hair along the animal's neck. "No, look at this." She parted the mane to reveal a section of hair knotted in a precise pattern, grown long but unmistakable. "That's a therapy braid. I used to see them when I volunteered at Ruth Alder's riding camp years ago. She braided therapy horses so kids would know which ones were safe to approach." Maya's eyes widened. "So he belonged there?" "Maybe," Lila said, "but the camp shut down almost a decade ago." Jack frowned. Ruth Alder was a name he hadn't heard in years, the widow who once ran programs for children with disabilities. He remembered his late wife speaking fondly of her, but he also remembered rumors that Ruth had disappeared into the hills after losing funding, living like a ghost in a cabin nobody could find. The wind picked up outside, rattling the tin roof. Rainmark jerked his head, ears pricking toward the north. His muscles quivered, his whole frame pointed like a compass needle. Lila stepped back. "Wherever he came from, he hasn't forgotten, and he doesn't want us to forget either." Later, over coffee at the kitchen table, Lila spoke of Ruth with a faraway look. She believed horses could carry memory, not just muscle memory, but a kind of imprint of where they belonged. People laughed, but maybe she was right. Jack rubbed a hand over his face. "I don't buy mystical talk. Horses follow instinct, food, shelter, safety." "And yet," Lila replied gently, "instinct brought him here, didn't it?" The words sat between them like a stone dropped into water. Jack stared into the dark outside the window. His fields stretched silent under the moonlight, but his mind wandered to the ridges rising beyond them. Somewhere in those shadowed valleys was the answer Rainmark refused to give up. Maya broke the silence. "If we don't follow him, we'll never know. Maybe someone needs help. Maybe Ruth's still out there." Jack almost snapped, but the look in her eyes stopped him. It was the same stubborn glint Sam once had when convincing him to ride bareback across the meadows. He exhaled slowly, the old fracture in his chest aching again. "Tomorrow," he said finally, though the word tasted foreign. "Tomorrow we'll see where those footprints lead." Rainmark shifted in the barn, a low wicker rolling into the night. It wasn't the sound of restlessness anymore. It was the sound of a creature waiting. The next day brought a sunless dawn, heavy clouds crouching low over the valley. Jack rose early, but instead of preparing tools for fieldwork, he gathered letters from the county office and a stack of bills that had arrived in yesterday's mail. He spread them across the kitchen table like cards in a losing hand. The numbers told the story clearly enough. Water rights, overdue notes, irrigation fees, and the looming threat of foreclosure. It wasn't just about crops anymore. It was about survival. When Maya padded into the kitchen, still in her sweatshirt from the night before, she studied her father's hunched shoulders. "It's about the water again, isn't it?" she asked. Jack didn't answer right away. He only tapped one page with a calloused finger. "Kincaid Development," he said. "They're filing to buy up the rights downstream. If they get their way, our fields will dry out by next summer. Maya sat down, chin propped on her hand. Can they really do that? Just take it? They can, if they throw enough money around. Water's the new gold out here. His voice hardened, laced with frustration. And we don't have enough gold to fight them. The kitchen door creaked open, and Lila stepped in, brushing off her coat. She'd stopped by again, this time carrying a folder of veterinary notes, but also a newspaper folded under her arm. "Morning," she said. "I thought you'd want to see this." She slid the paper across the table. On the front page, a headline read, "Resort expansion plans announced for Wallowa Lake." Beneath it, a smiling photograph of Trent Kincaid, the company's CEO, shook hands with county officials. Jack swore under his breath. He's everywhere now, buying goodwill before the paperwork even clears. Lila frowned. "I know him. He doesn't play fair." She glanced toward Maya, then lowered her voice. "If he wants this valley, he won't stop until he owns it." The barn door clanged in the distance, and all three turned their heads instinctively. Rainmark had begun pacing again, hooves carving the dirt in that same northern line. It was as if the horse sensed the weight of the conversation, reminding them silently of a path beyond the farm. Before Jack could speak, the crunch of tires on gravel announced another visitor. Ethan Cho, the local ranger, stepped out of his government-issued truck. His jacket bore the Forest Service patch, and his expression was serious. Jack met him halfway up the path. "Heard you've got a new horse," Ethan said. His eyes flicked toward the barn. "That's not why I'm here, though. I wanted to warn you. Hunting season opens tomorrow. The northern slopes will be crawling with rifles. If that animal of yours is leading you into the wilderness, you'd better think twice." Jack bristled. "We're not going anywhere." But Ethan studied him closely, as if reading the lie. "You've been restless, Jack. I can see it. Just remember, the forest isn't forgiving, especially in October." His gaze softened, though. "Still, if you do go, let someone know. People vanish in those hills." Back inside, Jack dropped into his chair, pinching the bridge of his nose. Lila leaned forward. "He's right, you know. If Rainmark keeps pushing you toward the mountains, there's a reason, but it's not without risk." Maya spoke up, her voice steady despite her youth. "Dad, maybe the answer isn't here at this table. Maybe it's out there. Maybe that horse is showing us a way to fight back against Kincaid." Jack laughed, but it was hollow. "A horse isn't going to stop a resort company." "Maybe not," Maya replied softly, "but he might lead us to something that can." The words lingered in the air, impossible to brush aside. Jack stared at the unpaid bills, at the grinning face of Trent Kincaid in the newspaper, then at the barn where Rainmark stood waiting. The weight of land and water pressed down on him, but beneath it, a different weight stirred. The pull of a story larger than debt and drought. That night, Jack walked out to the paddock. The mountains loomed in the distance, dark against the fading sky. Rainmark stood by the fence, ears forward, body aligned northward like a needle that refused to waver. Jack rested a hand on the fence post, the wood rough beneath his palm. "You think you know something I don't," he murmured. The horse turned its head slightly, eyes catching the last light, unblinking. And Jack, though unwilling to admit it aloud, felt the truth pressing against his ribs. Maybe it did. By the time dawn slipped across the valley again, the decision had already been made. Jack hardly remembered saying yes, but he had. Maybe it was Maya's insistence, or Lila's quiet conviction, or simply the way Rainmark never stopped staring north. Either way, The farm would have to wait. The horse had become the compass, and they were going to follow. They packed lightly: water, food, a first aid kit, blankets strapped across saddlebags. Jack saddled Buck, his quarter-horse gelding, who looked puzzled to see Rainmark tethered beside him. Rainmark wore no saddle, only a halter and lead rope. He pawed at the ground, restless, while the autumn wind whispered through the barn rafters. Maya adjusted her backpack with more excitement than fear, though Jack could see her hands trembling when she thought he wasn't looking. Lila checked her supplies twice over, the practiced calm of a woman used to emergencies. When the gate opened, Rainmark surged forward, as if he had been waiting his whole life for this moment. The trail wound past the alfalfa fields, where leaves of yellow and bronze clung to the last of summer's bounty. Beyond, the land lifted toward the foothills, where maples flared crimson against the green of ponderosa pines. The earth smelled of damp soil and pine resin, a perfume of the season that clung to their clothes. Jack rode behind Rainmark, uneasy. He had spent years avoiding these hills, keeping to the safe routines of the valley floor. Now each step upward felt like trespassing on a memory he had long tried to bury. The sound of Buck's hooves was steady, but Rainmark moved with purpose, not once pausing to graze or glance back. He carried himself like an animal who knew the way home. Hours passed. The wind grew sharper, carrying the distant echo of a train horn from the Union Pacific line. It was a strange sound in the wilderness, civilization bleeding into wild country. Jack felt the tug of two worlds in that whistle, one of contracts, debts, and land battles, the other of silence, secrets, and paths unmarked. They stopped by a creek at midday. Maya knelt to cup water in her hands, her reflection broken by the current. "It feels different up here," she said, glancing at her father. "Like the air is older?" Jack didn't answer. He watched Rainmark instead, noting how the horse stood not at rest but alert, head turned upstream as though listening for something only he could hear. Lila joined him, brushing stray hair from her forehead. "He's leading us," she said simply. Jack wanted to argue, to insist they were just indulging Maya's fantasy. But the words stuck. He had seen determination in animals before, the way cattle push through snow to reach water, or dogs return miles to their homes. Yet Rainmark's drive felt heavier, like he carried someone else's burden. By late afternoon, the leaves deepened into shades of blood and fire. The trail narrowed, switchbacks climbing through groves of quaking aspen, whose white trunks gleamed in the fading light. Each gust sent a storm of golden coins spinning down, covering their path. Jack thought of his brother again. Sam riding through autumn fields, hair tangled with wind, eyes full of daring. The memory pressed against him like the weight of the saddle, sharp and unrelenting. As they rounded a ridge, the valley fell away behind them. From here, the farm looked small, a patch of cultivated order against the sweep of wilderness. Jack pulled Buck to a halt, staring back. For a moment, he wondered if he had made a mistake, leaving his land vulnerable, following a horse into uncertainty. But then Rainmark whinnied, not impatiently, but almost gently, and Jack felt the decision tighten around him like a cinched girth. There was no turning back. They made camp before dusk, in a hollow where the ground was littered with needles and the air smelled of smoke from an unseen fire. Jack gathered wood while Maya spread out blankets. Lila brewed coffee over a small flame, its aroma threading through the chill. Rainmark remained near the edge of camp, eyes fixed north, the red leaves framing his silhouette like a crown. Jack sat by the fire, mug warming his hands, watching his daughter laugh quietly with Lila as they shared stories. The sound stirred something inside him, a reminder that life could still hold moments of grace, even under the shadow of struggle. Yet when his gaze drifted to Rainmark, he saw not peace, but urgency. A silent command that tomorrow they must keep climbing. As the fire sank to embers, the forest grew hushed. Jack lay awake, listening to the creak of trees and the occasional stamp of Rainmark's hooves. He thought of the resort plans, the water rights slipping through his fingers, the weight of debts that had nearly broken him, and he thought of the horse, with its rain-marked back and scarred shoulder, carrying a message he hadn't yet deciphered. Before sleep claimed him, Jack whispered into the dark, "What are you trying to show us?" Rainmark, standing under the skeletal branches, tossed his head once, as if answering in a language older than words. Morning came wrapped in fog, the kind that blurred edges and muffled sound until the world felt half-dreamed. Jack stirred the fire back to life, its smoke climbing into the damp air. Maya slept curled in her blanket, her hand resting on Rainmark's halter, as though even in sleep she feared he might slip away. The horse stood steady beside her, ears twitching but body calm. Jack found himself pausing, watching the quiet scene. It had been years since he had seen his daughter look so at peace. They broke camp as the fog thinned. The trail ahead curved through marshy ground, a stretch Jack hadn't expected. Fallen leaves floated on waterlogged soil, and the earth gave under each step. Buck, sure-footed as always, tested the ground cautiously. But Rainmark surged forward, eager, tugging at the lead rope in Jack's hand. "Easy," Jack muttered, pulling back. The horse tossed its head in frustration, hooves sloshing into the mud. The marsh deepened quickly. Maya's boots sank to her ankles, and Lila steadied her with a hand. "We should circle wide," Jack said, scanning for a safer route. But Rainmark kept moving toward the center, his body taut with insistence. The horse's pace quickened until suddenly his foreleg plunged into a hidden pocket of mire. He lurched sideways, panic flashing in his eyes as the mud clutched tight. "Dad!" Maya cried, lunging forward. Jack swung down from Buck without thinking. He waded through the muck, the cold sucking at his boots, until he reached Rainmark. The horse thrashed once, wild-eyed, chest heaving. Jack pressed a hand to his neck, firm but gentle. "Easy, boy. Easy." His voice dropped low, steady as he could manage. For a moment, he saw another face. Sam's, lit by firelight, eyes wide with fear. The memory hit like a blow, but Jack shoved it aside. He focused on the horse beneath his hands, the tremor in its muscles, the desperate pull for freedom. "I've got you," he whispered. "You're not alone." He slipped the halter free, tossed aside his pack, and braced his shoulder against Rainmark's flank. With a grunt, he pushed while guiding the horse forward. Mud sucked and released with a sound like tearing cloth. The horse staggered, stumbled, then found firmer ground. Jack nearly collapsed beside him, mud streaking his coat, his chest hammering. Rainmark stood trembling, sides heaving. Jack kept his hand on him, waiting for the shudder to ease. Slowly the horse lowered his head until his forehead brushed Jack's chest. Jack froze, hardly breathing. Then, almost against his will, he lifted a hand and rested it against the animal's damp mane. Maya's voice was soft behind him. "He trusts you now." Jack swallowed hard. He wanted to deny it, to say it was nothing more than relief after panic. But the weight of the moment pressed deeper than that. He felt the warmth of Rainmark's breath, the steady thump of his heart. It wasn't just trust. It was surrender, the first fragile thread of a bond neither of them had asked for. They rested on higher ground, giving Rainmark time to recover. Lila cleaned the small scrape on his leg, her hands deft and reassuring. Jack watched, silent, while Maya stroked the horse's neck. He had thought himself long past these things, past the language of touch and patience that horses required, yet here it was again, alive in his hands and his daughter's eyes. The trail beyond the marsh rose into golden meadows, where the wind carried the scent of sage and sun-warmed pine. Rainmark moved steadily now, no longer fighting the lead. Instead, he matched Jack's pace, his body brushing close as if tethered by more than rope. Jack caught himself glancing at the horse often, uneasy at the new weight pressing inside his chest. That night, they camped beneath aspens that shivered silver in the moonlight. Maya fell asleep quickly, her hand once again tangled in Rainmark's halter. Lila lingered by the fire, sipping from her thermos. "What happened out there today?" she said quietly. "It wasn't just instinct. He chose to let you help him." Jack poked at the fire with a stick, watching sparks rise. Maybe. Or maybe he didn't have a choice. Lila's gaze held his. "We always have a choice, even animals. Especially animals." Jack didn't answer, but when he lay down, he kept his eyes on Rainmark, standing just beyond the circle of firelight. The horse raised his head, meeting his gaze across the distance. For the first time, Jack didn't look away. By the third day in the hills, the forest began to change. Pines gave way to thick stands of fir, their trunks rising like pillars into the gray sky. The air grew cooler, sharper, and the silence deepened until even the sound of Buck's hooves felt like an intrusion. Jack rode at the rear, his eyes scanning the narrow trail, his mind wrestling with questions he couldn't shake. Why had Rainmark brought them here? What could possibly lie ahead that was worth this risk? Rainmark slowed as the trees thickened, then stopped altogether. Ears pricked forward. Maya tugged lightly on the rope. "What is it, boy?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The horse snorted and stepped toward a narrow side path, one Jack hadn't noticed. The trail bent between moss-covered rocks, half hidden under fallen branches. Jack frowned, but nodded. "All right," he muttered, guiding Buck behind. They wound upward until the air smelled faintly of wood smoke. Jack froze, instinct tightening in his chest. This wasn't the drifting scent of a distant campfire. It was fresh, close. Rainmark pressed forward, nostrils flaring. Then they saw it. A cabin nestled in a hollow, roof sagging but intact, its door painted a faded shade of green that stood out against the wilderness. Smoke curled faintly from the chimney, thin as a whisper. Jack's grip tightened on the reins. Cabins this deep weren't common. Whoever lived here had chosen isolation for a reason. They dismounted quietly, tying the horses a safe distance away. Rainmark pawed the ground, trembling, not from cold, Jack realized, but from something sharper, a recognition almost human. The horse's entire frame leaned toward the cabin. Maya clutched his arm. "Dad, someone's inside." Jack nodded, his eyes on the door. The paint peeled in long strips, revealing gray wood beneath. Yet there was something stubborn about that green, as if it had refused to fade entirely. He approached slowly, every sense alive to the creak of branches, the sigh of wind. Lila followed, medical bag slung across her shoulder, her face taut with concern. Jack knocked once. The sound echoed strangely, hollow and thin. No answer. He glanced at Lila, then pushed gently. The door resisted at first, then swung inward on rusty hinges. The interior was dim, lit only by the glow of embers in a small fireplace. The smell of smoke was stronger now, mixed with something sour, stale air and neglect. A wooden table sat cluttered with papers and jars, a single chair drawn close. Against the far wall, beneath a moth-eaten quilt, lay a figure. Jack stepped forward cautiously. An elderly woman stirred, her face pale, hair silver and tangled. Her eyes fluttered open, startlingly bright despite her frailty. "Who?" Her voice cracked into a rasp. "Who are you?" Jack knelt beside her, his soldier's instinct for triage kicking in. "Name's Jack Mercer," he said softly. "We're not here to hurt you. You need help." He reached for her wrist, feeling the faint, thready pulse. The woman's gaze shifted past him. "Scout," she whispered. Her lips trembled into the ghost of a smile. "You found him." Jack turned, startled. Rainmark had stepped halfway into the cabin, eyes fixed on the woman. For the first time since they had found him, the horse seemed utterly still, breathing slow, ears forward as though drinking in her voice. Maya's hand flew to her mouth. "She knows him." The woman's eyes filled with tears. "I thought I'd lost you forever," she murmured, reaching a frail hand toward Rainmark. The horse lowered his head, nuzzling her palm with a tenderness that silenced the room. Jack felt a shiver run through him, as if he had stumbled into the heart of the horse's mission. Lila unpacked her bag, moving briskly. "She's dehydrated, weak. We'll need to stabilize her before we move her anywhere." She glanced at Jack, her voice low. "If Rainmark brought us here, it wasn't by chance." The woman stirred again, gripping Jack's sleeve with surprising strength. "I'm Ruth Alder," she said. "I used to run a camp for children. Scout was one of my therapy horses. He was the bravest of them all." Her voice faltered. "They shut us down. I stayed. I had nowhere else to go." Jack exchanged a glance with Lila. The story made sense. The braid in Rainmark's mane, the urgency in his movements, the unrelenting pull north. He had been searching for the woman who once trusted him to carry children through fear. Maya whispered, awed. He remembered. Jack sat back on his heels, the truth settling heavy in his chest. All the resistance, the doubts, the walls he had built. Suddenly they felt small against the sight of a horse reuniting with the one who had once given him purpose. Rainmark hadn't been wandering. He had been leading. As Ruth's eyes closed again in exhaustion, Jack looked at the green door behind him, its color defiant against the wilderness. For years, this place had hidden a story no one in town had spoken of. Now, standing inside it, Jack understood. The horse had not only brought them to her, he had dragged Jack back into a world where trust and memory mattered more than land or water. Outside, the wind picked up, shaking the fir branches. Rainmark lifted his head, ears flicking toward the mountains beyond. Jack followed his gaze, uneasy. The cabin wasn't the end of the trail. It was only the threshold. The fire crackled low in Ruth Alder's cabin, throwing faint shadows on the log walls. Lila worked steadily, pressing a cup of water to Ruth's lips, urging her to drink in slow sips. Jack stood nearby, arms crossed, scanning the room with cautious eyes. The place carried the must of years. Dusty curtains, shelves lined with jars of herbs long dried, stacks of papers curling with age. It felt less like a home than a vault, a repository of memories and silence. Rainmark had not moved from his post at Ruth's bedside. The horse stood, as though guarding her, his breath fogging the cool air drifting through the open door. Ruth's hand never left the coarse strands of his mane, her fingers clinging as though afraid he would vanish again if she let go. Maya knelt on the floor, listening to Ruth with rapt attention, her eyes bright with a mix of wonder and worry. "Scout remembered," Ruth whispered, her voice fragile but insistent. "I knew he would. Horses don't forget kindness or cruelty." Her gaze drifted toward the table in the corner, stacked with yellowed files. "There's something you should see. It matters more than you think." Jack hesitated. He had no patience for riddles, not with the woman clearly exhausted, but Ruth's eyes sharpened, flashing with the same determination that blazed in Rainmark's. He finally crossed the room, lifting the top folder from the pile. Its cover was marked with faded ink, the name Mercer scrawled across the top. His own name. Inside lay brittle pages, copies of deeds, surveys stamped with state seals, and handwritten notes in his grandfather's familiar script. Jack's pulse quickened. He hadn't seen that handwriting in years, but the sharp strokes and looping flourishes were unmistakable. Lila leaned closer, her brows knitting. "These are land agreements," she murmured. "Old ones. Look, water rights, conservation easements. This predates half the county's current files." Jack flipped through quickly, his throat tightening. One page bore his grandfather's signature alongside the emblem of the Bureau of Reclamation. The document outlined shared water access, stipulating that the creek cutting through his family's farm could never be sold or privatized. It was to remain a communal resource, protected under law. "That's impossible," Jack muttered. "If this is valid, Kincaid doesn't stand a chance." Ruth gave a faint nod. "Your grandfather wanted to protect this valley. He knew men like Kincaid would come." She coughed, the sound rattling her chest. "He left copies with me when the camp closed. He said, if his family ever needed them, I'd know when to give them back." Maya's eyes widened. "That's why Rainmark brought us here. He knew. Somehow he knew." Jack shook his head, unwilling to embrace what sounded like fantasy. But the truth was there, weighty in his hands. Every page spoke of foresight, of promises made before he was even born. He sank into the chair, the files spread before him like a map of the past. Lila touched his shoulder lightly. "This could change everything. But we'll need to verify it legally. Chain of custody, notarization. Without that, it's just paper." Jack looked up sharply. "Then we get it verified." Ruth's lips curved into the faintest smile. "Good. Then I can rest easier." She leaned back against the quilt, her hand still gripping Rainmark's mane. Scout carried more than memory. He carried duty. And now he's passed it to you. Silence fell over the cabin, broken only by the whisper of wind through the chimney. Jack stared at the fire, the old fracture inside him aching again. His grandfather had thought ahead, built a safeguard into the bones of the land. And Jack, who had spent years feeling like he had failed every duty, now held proof that he had inherited one more. When night deepened, they prepared to stay. Lila settled Ruth with fresh blankets. Maya curled near Rainmark, exhaustion finally pulling her under. Jack sat alone at the table, the papers spread in lamplight. He traced his grandfather's name with one finger, remembering the steady voice that had once guided him through fields, through storms, through boyhood. "You knew," Jack whispered into the quiet. "You knew I'd need this." Rainmark shifted, stamping a hoof softly as though in answer. Jack looked up at him, the firelight catching the streak of damp hair along his back, the mark that had given him his name. For the first time, Jack wondered if perhaps the horse wasn't just leading them to Ruth, but to the truth buried in his family's story. Outside, the night pressed heavy, filled with unseen eyes and unspoken threats. But within the cabin's walls, a fragile certainty flickered. The past had not been lost. It had been waiting. The cabin had grown quieter by morning, the fire reduced to ash, and a faint chill creeping back into the air. Jack woke stiff from the wooden chair, his arms folded on the table where the old files still lay scattered. For a moment, he wasn't sure if it had all been a dream. The horse that had led them here, the frail woman who recognized him, the documents that could upend the valley's future. Then Rainmark's low nicker stirred the silence, grounding him in reality. Ruth was awake, propped against pillows that Lila had arranged, sipping weak tea. The light from the small window painted her face in pale strokes, but her eyes were alert. She beckoned Maya closer. "You remind me of the children who came to my camp," Ruth said, her voice stronger now. "They carried scars no one else could see, but when they climbed on Scout's back, something changed. He made them feel whole, if only for a little while." Maya smiled softly, her hand brushing Rainmark's neck. "He makes me feel like that too." Jack listened from the doorway, arms folded. There was tenderness in Ruth's tone, but also a thread of grief. She began to speak of the past, the summers filled with children who laughed again after months of silence, the parents who cried quietly watching them ride. She described how Scout once carried a boy with cerebral palsy across a shallow stream, the child gripping the saddle horn with white-knuckled fear, until the horse slowed, waited, and stepped so carefully that by the time they reached the far bank, the boy was smiling. Her eyes drifted, dimming. When the funding ended, they closed us down. The children stopped coming. I stayed because I didn't know where else to go. Scout was sold. I thought I'd never see him again. She reached for the horse's face, and Rainmark leaned in, the bond between them radiating through the small room. Jack felt a weight in her words that mirrored his own. Survivors, he thought. That's what they both were, she surviving the collapse of her life's work, him surviving the fire that had carved his family in half. Both had lost something that could never truly return, and yet both were still here, breathing the same thin mountain air. When Ruth's breathing grew uneven, Lila urged her to rest. Jack stepped outside, needing the open sky. The forest stretched in solemn silence, shafts of light piercing the mist. He walked to where the creek cut across the clearing, kneeling to wash his face in the cold water. The shock woke him fully, but it also dredged up memories he'd buried. Sam had been fearless. Sam had trusted Jack to come back for him. Jack hadn't. He saw the flames again, the wall of heat, the decision that still chained his heart. He clenched his fists in the icy water until his knuckles burned. Survivors, yes, but survival wasn't the same as living. Behind him, footsteps crunched on pine needles. Maya stood with her blanket around her shoulders. "You think you were the only one who lost him," she said quietly. But I lost him too. He was my uncle. He made me laugh. And I lost you at the same time, Dad." Jack looked at her, stunned. She didn't cry. She didn't accuse. She just stood there, her voice steady with the weight of her truth. He felt something shift in his chest, a small crack widening. Rainmark walked up then, his presence grounding them both. He nudged Jack's shoulder, then Maya's, before lowering his head to drink from the creek. The simple gesture, unhurried, ordinary, felt profound. Jack reached out, his hand brushing his daughter's, and for the first time in years, he didn't pull away. Later, back inside, Ruth whispered something more. "Your grandfather once told me, we can't always stop loss, but we can decide what survives after it. He believed the land should survive for those who need it most. That's why he left those files with me." Jack folded the brittle papers carefully, tucking them into his pack. They were no longer just documents. They were lifelines. One for the valley, one for his family, and maybe one for himself. As evening settled, they sat together by the fire. Ruth with her tea, Lila mending a torn glove, Maya humming softly, Rainmark dozing with one ear always turned north. Jack felt the old fracture inside him, but for once it didn't ache with only guilt. It pulsed with something new. Responsibility, yes, but also the faintest edge of hope. He looked at Ruth, at his daughter, at the horse who had carried them here. "We're survivors," he said under his breath. The words weren't heavy this time. They were a promise. The first sign was the wind. It swept down from the ridges at dusk, sharper and colder than it should have been for early October. Jack stepped outside the cabin, pulling his coat tight as he watched the treetops bend and sway. The smell of snow was on the air, that metallic tang that always preceded a storm. He glanced back through the green door, where Ruth dozed by the fire, and felt the weight of unease settle in his chest. Lila joined him on the porch, her eyes scanning the sky. "That's not just weather," she said. "That's a front coming in fast. We won't be going anywhere tonight." Jack nodded grimly. The mountains had their own laws, and no one argued with them. He checked the horses, tightening blankets across their backs, securing feed where the wind wouldn't scatter it. Rainmark shifted restlessly, ears twitching, gaze locked northward, even as the air thickened with the promise of snow. Inside, Maya busied herself, setting out blankets and warming canned stew over the fire. She tried to make it feel like home, passing bowls, humming an old tune Ruth had taught her that afternoon. But the tension in the room was unshakable. The walls creaked under gusts, and fine powder began drifting in through cracks in the shutters. The storm arrived in full after nightfall. Snow hammered the roof, the wind howling like a wild animal through the timbers. The cabin shuddered, but held. Jack sat close to the fire, the old files spread on his lap. He read them again by lamplight, the words blurring as exhaustion pressed against him. Each clause, each signature was another thread binding him to the past, another reminder of the duty he hadn't asked for but could no longer ignore. Ruth stirred, her voice rasping through the roar outside. "I've seen storms like this before. They strip everything down, leave only what's strong enough to last." She sipped her tea, her hands trembling. "Sometimes that's the only way to know what survives." Maya leaned against Jack's shoulder, her warmth a quiet anchor. He didn't push her away. Outside, Rainmark stamped in the lean-to, refusing the comfort of the enclosed stall. Through the slats, Jack could see the horse standing square against the wind, head high, body braced as though guarding them all. The image carved itself into him, a creature battered yet unbowed. Hours stretched into a restless vigil. Lila dozed in a chair, her stethoscope still around her neck, while Jack paced, listening to the roof groan. He thought of the farm below, of fences collapsing under snow, of Kincaid's smiling face in that newspaper photo. The world outside this cabin seemed impossibly far, yet the storm reminded him how fragile everything was. One bad season could undo a lifetime of work. When the fire burned low, Jack went to the door and cracked it open. Snow swept in instantly, stinging his face. The forest was gone, swallowed in white. Rainmark turned his head at the sound, eyes catching the lamplight. He gave a low rumble, not fear, but acknowledgement, as though to say, "We endure." Jack shut the door, leaning against it for a long moment. He realized the truth Ruth had spoken. Storms revealed what was strong enough to survive. And here, in this fragile cabin with its faded green door, strength wasn't found in land or water rights, or even in the old files tucked safely away. It was in the people huddled around the fire. It was in the horse outside, refusing to yield. It was in the choice to keep going, no matter what had already been lost. By dawn, the storm had softened, leaving the world blanketed in white. The silence was profound, broken only by the creak of branches and the soft huff of the horses. Jack stepped out into the snow, boots sinking deep, and drew a long breath of the cold morning air. The valley below would be unreachable for days. They were cut off, bound to this place, until the mountain allowed them passage. Rainmark pressed close to him, warm breath clouding in the air. Jack laid a hand on his neck, not with the hesitation of before, but with quiet acceptance. "We'll wait it out together," he said. His voice was low, but steady. The words were more than a promise to the horse. They were a vow to his daughter, to Ruth, to himself. For the first time in years, Jack didn't feel like he was running from the past. The storm had stripped him bare, and what remained was fragile, yes, but strong enough to last. The storm eased, but its silence was heavier than its fury. Snow lay thick around the cabin, muffling every sound. The forest seemed to hold its breath. Jack stepped outside at first light, crunching through drifts to check the horses. Buck was restless, pawing at the snow for forage, but Rainmark stood quietly, head lifted toward the pale sky. His body was dusted white, mane stiff with frost. He looked almost sculpted out of winter itself. Jack brushed the snow from his back, muttering, "You're tougher than the rest of us." Rainmark exhaled, his breath warm against Jack's face. But then a sharp bang shattered the stillness, the cabin door slamming in the wind. The sound was harmless, yet Rainmark jolted violently, eyes rolling white. He reared slightly, backing into the snowbank. Jack's gut clenched. He grabbed the lead rope, but Rainmark jerked free, panic thrumming through every line of his body. "Whoa, easy!" Jack barked, voice sharper than intended. The horse thrashed against the air, his fear spilling like fire through the clearing. Maya came running, eyes wide. "Dad, stop yelling!" But Jack couldn't stop. The old fracture inside him split wider. He saw fire again, the collapse of a burning roof, his brother's voice drowned by crackling flames. The helplessness, the fury at himself, it all poured into his shout. "Stand still!" he roared. Rainmark skidded, nearly toppling into the cabin wall, snow flying in sprays. Maya threw herself between them, arms outstretched. You're scaring him. Jack froze, breath ragged. His daughter's voice cut through the storm raging inside him. He saw not just the terrified horse, but also Maya's frightened face, her blanket still draped around her shoulders. Shame crashed over him like cold water. His knees weakened, and for the first time in years, he didn't fight it. He dropped to the snow, his voice breaking. I couldn't save him. Maya's arms lowered slowly. Uncle Sam. Jack nodded, staring at the ground. The confession tore free before he could stop it. The night of the fire, I thought I had time. I thought if I hauled more water, I could protect the barn, the animals, everything. But by the time I went back, his voice cracked. He was gone. I made the wrong choice and it cost your uncle his life. Every horse reminds me of that night. Every one. The silence that followed was raw. Snowflakes drifted in the air, melting on his face, mingling with tears he hadn't let himself shed in decades. Maya stepped closer, kneeling beside him. Her small hand touched his arm. Dad, it wasn't your fault. You did what you thought would save everyone. Uncle Sam loved the horses. He would have done the same thing. Her voice trembled, but her eyes were steady. But you didn't just lose him that night. You lost yourself, too. And I lost you. Jack looked at her then. Really looked. He saw the young woman she was becoming, the quiet strength in her gaze. For years he had carried the burden alone, believing silence would shield her from it. But silence had only built walls between them. Rainmark shifted, lowering his head cautiously. His nostrils flared as he stepped toward Jack, ears flicking nervously but curiosity overcoming fear. Jack wiped his face with the back of his sleeve, then did something he hadn't done in years. He loosened the rope in his hands and let it fall slack. If you want to go, he whispered, voice raw, you can. I won't stop you. You choose. For a moment, the horse stood still, muscles quivering. Then he took a slow step forward. Another, until his muzzle pressed into Jack's open palm. The warmth of it melted something in him that the fire hadn't burned away. Not guilt, not grief, but trust. Fragile, undeserved, yet freely given. Maya let out a shaky breath, smiling through her tears. He chose you. Jack closed his eyes, resting his forehead briefly against Rainmark's. Maybe it's time I chose to stay, he whispered. Inside the cabin, Ruth watched from the doorway, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Lila stood behind her, eyes glistening in the cold light. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. The sight before them was enough. A broken man, a restless horse, and a bond reforged not by force, but by surrender. The wind sighed through the trees, carrying away the last echoes of the storm. What remained was quiet, heavy, and whole. The storm had passed, but its hush lingered over the valley. Snow clung to every branch, bending firs into frozen arches. Jack stepped outside first, his breath rising in the sharp morning air. The world glowed white, dazzling under a fragile sun. Rainmark followed, pressing close as if to remind him that their fragile bond was real. Jack laid a hand against the horse's neck, feeling the steady pulse beneath the winter coat. It anchored him. By midday, the trail crunch of tires broke the silence. Jack's stomach tightened when he saw the dark SUV forcing its way through the snow-packed track. A man in a heavy coat climbed out, boots too clean for the wilderness. Trent Kincaid. His lawyer followed, briefcase in hand, already scanning the cabin as if it were a parcel waiting to be claimed. You've got something that belongs to me, Kincaid said, his voice smooth, confident. Those old water agreements, they won't hold in court. His eyes flicked toward Ruth, then narrowed. And dragging her into this? Cruel, Mercer. She should be in a nursing home, not clinging to fairy tales in the woods. Jack stepped between him and the cabin door. They're not fairy tales. They're law. My grandfather made sure of it. The lawyer adjusted his glasses. Outdated law. Unenforceable. My client has the county commission on his side. He has investors, developers, permits. Paper, Jack cut in. His voice was low, steady. You can stack it high enough to reach the clouds, but it won't change what was signed and sealed before your company existed. The creek isn't yours to sell. The standoff thickened, breath frosting in the cold. Then the crunch of another vehicle cut through. A green Forest Service truck rolled into view, its tires grinding through the snow with patient determination. Ethan Cho stepped out, ranger hat pulled low, clipboard under one arm. He greeted no one with warmth, only formality. Got a call from a concerned neighbor. Said some folks were up here during a storm. Thought I'd check it out. His eyes swept over the group, resting last on Kincaid. Ranger Cho, Kincaid said smoothly. Glad you're here. We have a bit of a dispute. Nothing serious, just a matter of outdated documents. Ethan raised a brow. Outdated or not, anything concerning water rights in this district falls under federal purview, and anything concerning elderly residents being pressured falls under my report. He stepped closer to Jack, lowering his voice. You've got proof? Jack lifted the folder from his pack. The brittle pages rattled in the cold air. Right here. Original signatures, notarized. Bureau seals intact. Ethan took the documents carefully, his gloved hands precise. He flipped through, nodding once. These will need to be authenticated back in the county seat. But if they check out, Kincaid, you don't have a claim. Not on this creek, not on this land. Kincaid's composure cracked, if only slightly. Do you realize what you're interfering with? This isn't just a resort, it's jobs, revenue, progress. The sound came then, faint at first, then rising over the frozen valley. Church bells, Sunday bells, carried clear from the town below, echoing against the mountainsides. Everyone stilled. Even Rainmark lifted his head, ears turning toward the sound. Ruth stepped into the doorway, her blanket pulled tight, her voice trembling but firm. Do you hear it, Trent? That's the sound of community, of neighbors who won't be bought. The bells kept tolling, solemn and sure. Jack felt the weight of them in his chest. They weren't just bells. They were witness. They rang for every farmer, every child, every story written into the soil of the valley. He stood straighter. You can take your papers, Jack said evenly, and you can try your politics. But this valley isn't for sale. Not while I draw breath. Not while my daughter stands here. Not while this horse remembers the path back to the people who loved him. Kincaid's lawyer shifted uncomfortably, muttering about litigation, but Ethan closed the folder, his tone final. Until a judge says otherwise, these documents stand. You'll leave them be. The bells rang on, and in their echoes, Jack felt something lift inside him. The fracture that had defined him for so long was still there, but it was no longer hollow. It was filled now with the sound of defiance, of belonging, of a community he had nearly given up on, but that still had room for him. Rainmark pressed against his shoulder, steady and calm. Jack breathed deep, the crisp air burning his lungs, and knew they had crossed into something new. This fight was no longer just his. It belonged to the valley. The day after the confrontation, the cabin felt strangely still. Kincaid and his lawyer had left in frustration, their promises of litigation hanging in the frozen air. Ethan Cho carried the fragile documents down the mountain to be authenticated, leaving Jack with a silence that felt heavier than the storm itself. The snow around the clearing glistened under a cold sun, but inside the cabin, the shadows seemed longer. Ruth was weaker that morning. She sat wrapped in layers of blankets near the hearth, her breathing shallow, her eyes still burning with the fire of a woman who had seen too much to surrender easily. She beckoned Jack closer with a tremor in her hand. "There's more," she whispered. "Your grandfather left something else with me, something I couldn't bring myself to open until now." She pointed to a small chest beneath the bed, its surface scratched and dulled by time. Jack pulled it into the light, the iron clasp stiff with rust. He pried it open carefully. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, lay a weathered, leather-bound journal. The initials W.M. were pressed faintly into the cover. Jack's chest tightened. William Mercer, his grandfather. The leather creaked as he opened it. The first pages were filled with neat handwriting, strong at first, then shakier as the years wore on. Jack read in silence, the words pulling him deeper with each line. They were not ledgers or farm notes. They were confessions. "I fear my children will inherit my silence more than my land. A man can pass on property, but guilt has a way of breeding in the blood." Jack's hands trembled. He had always remembered his grandfather as stern, practical, a man of the soil who wasted no words. To see such raw honesty inked into the pages unsettled him. Further entries spoke of the valley, his conviction that water should remain free for all who tilled the soil, his disdain for speculators who valued profit over people. But threaded through were pieces of something else, something Jack had never known. Dreams of creating a place where horses could be healers. "If the valley survives, I want a corner of it given back. Not to the ranchers, not to the banks, but to the children who need it. The horses understand them in ways we cannot. One day, if my family needs a way forward, perhaps this dream will be their salvation." Jack shut the book, staring into the fire. The words struck too close. They mirrored Ruth's stories of her camp, of Scout carrying children through fear. They mirrored the fracture in himself, the silent wound that had kept him from living. Maya leaned over his shoulder, her eyes wide. "He wanted the same thing you're doing now. He wanted to save them." Ruth's voice was faint, but insistent. "Your grandfather wasn't perfect. He carried his own ghosts, but he believed in second chances. That's why he gave me the journal, to pass on when the time was right." Jack pressed the journal to his chest, feeling the rough leather against his palm. His throat tightened. For years, he had thought of himself as a man chained by failure. But here, in his grandfather's own words, was proof that broken men could still dream of mending. Lila touched his arm gently. "This isn't just history. It's a blueprint. You could carry this forward." The idea daunted him. Yet when he looked at Rainmark, standing steady by the hearth, he saw more than a horse. He saw a bridge, from Ruth's camp to his grandfather's dream, from Sam's death to Maya's hope, from silence to something that could outlast him. Outside, church bells no longer rang. The storm had passed, and Kincaid was gone for now. But inside the cabin, Jack felt the true weight of legacy. It wasn't the land or the creek or even the old signatures. It was this journal, filled with imperfect words of a man who believed that pain could be transformed into healing. Jack closed his eyes, whispering into the quiet, "I won't let it die here." Rainmark shifted closer, brushing his shoulder with a soft nudge, as if to seal the vow. The snow melted slowly, dripping from the cabin roof in thin streams, as if the storm had wept itself empty. The air turned softer, carrying the smell of thawed earth and pine sap. For the first time in days, the path toward the ridges cleared enough to travel. Jack stood outside with Maya and Lila, watching the pale sunlight spill across the valley. Behind them, Ruth rested, her voice still weak, but her eyes brighter after a night of steady sleep. Rainmark paced the edge of the clearing, nostrils flaring as he gazed north. Beyond the white-tipped trees, the wilderness stretched toward the Eagle Cap, a kingdom of silence and wind. Jack followed his line of sight. He knew the horse could run now if he wanted, disappearing into the wild where no man could hold him. He thought of letting him go, an animal with scars and memories, choosing freedom over burdens. Maya's voice broke into his thoughts. "He doesn't want to leave us." Jack shook his head gently. "Maybe he should. He belongs out there. That's where he was headed before we stopped him." Rainmark lifted his head at the sound of Jack's voice, ears flicking, eyes steady. He took a few steps toward the tree line, then halted. Snow cracked under his hooves. The forest waited, a wide open door. Jack's chest tightened. He knew this was the moment. Trust wasn't something you forced. It was something you offered and waited to see returned or refused. He loosened the rope in his hand until it slid to the ground. His voice was low, but steady. "Go on, if that's what you need. You've done enough for us. You've shown us what we had forgotten." The silence was complete, save for the dripping of melting snow. Rainmark stood still, tail flicking once, breath steaming. Then he turned his head back toward Jack. His eyes lingered, searching, deciding. Slowly, he stepped forward, not into the trees, but toward the man who had finally released him. Maya let out a gasp, her hands clasped to her chest. Lila smiled faintly, shaking her head. Ruth, watching from the doorway, whispered something too soft for anyone to hear. Rainmark crossed the space between wilderness and clearing, stopping only when his shoulder brushed Jack's. He lowered his head, pressing his muzzle against Jack's chest, as if sealing a covenant. Jack closed his eyes, resting a hand along the horse's neck. His voice cracked as he whispered, "Then stay." The choice was not grand or loud. It was quiet, ordinary in its motion. Yet it shifted everything. For years, Jack had been haunted by the choice he couldn't undo, the night of the fire, the brother he hadn't saved. Now a horse had chosen him, not out of obligation, but out of trust, freely given. It didn't erase the past, but it softened it. It gave it shape and purpose. That evening, they sat together outside the cabin, watching the sky turn rose and gold. Maya leaned against her father's arm. Ruth hummed an old tune, and Lila's laughter rose softly at some small joke. Rainmark stood nearby, ears flicking, tail swishing lazily. He looked neither restless nor captive. He looked at home. As the sun slipped behind the ridges, Jack felt a quiet strength settle in his bones. Tomorrow they would ride back down into the valley, carrying the files, the journal, and the weight of choices old and new. But tonight was enough. Tonight, survival had turned into belonging. The descent from the mountains took 2 days. The snow still clung to shaded slopes, but the air had softened into something almost forgiving. Jack led Buck carefully along the trail, Maya riding close behind with Rainmark at her side. Lila followed, her steady presence grounding them, while Ruth rode bundled in blankets on a small sled Jack had rigged together, determined not to leave her behind. Each bend of the trail carried them closer to the valley, closer to the life waiting, and to the fight still ahead. When they reached the farm, the fields stretched wide under a pale sun, the alfalfa bent, but not broken beneath the weight of frost. Jack paused at the ridge, staring down at the house, the barn, the creek, glinting like a ribbon of silver. He thought of the files in his pack, the journal tucked safely within. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a man returning to a burden. He felt like a man returning to a promise. News traveled faster than snowmelt in small towns. Within a week, neighbors stopped by with casseroles, advice, and questions. Some came curious, some skeptical. But when Jack laid the files on the table at the county office, the officials couldn't deny what they saw. William Mercer's signature, the Bureau's seal, the words that bound the water to the land forever. Kincaid's resort stalled before it could even break ground. The man's smile vanished from the headlines as quietly as it had appeared. Yet it wasn't victory Jack thought of most. It was legacy. With Ruth at his side, he began drawing plans, not for expansion or profit, but for something gentler. The Mercer Alder Foundation, they decided to call it. A place where land and water would serve not just crops, but people, where horses would be more than livestock. They would be healers, teachers, companions for children who carried wounds invisible to most. The first time the gates opened, it wasn't grand. Just a few families arrived, carrying timid children who clutched stuffed animals tighter than reins. Jack helped lift one boy into the saddle, his small body rigid with fear. Rainmark stood perfectly still, lowering his head until the boy's hand touched his mane. Something shifted in that moment, soft, almost imperceptible. The boy's shoulders eased, his breathing slowed. A smile crept across his face, fragile as dawn. Jack felt tears prick his eyes. Maya laughed freely that day, running from paddock to paddock, helping children feed carrots to the horses. Ruth sat in a chair by the fence, her blanket wrapped around her, humming as if the camp she had once lost had returned in another form. Lila worked alongside them, sleeves rolled up, her medical bag never far from reach, but her smile was brighter than Jack had ever seen it. That evening, after the families left and the valley quieted, Jack stood at the edge of the creek. Rainmark approached, pressing his muzzle against Jack's arm. The water shimmered in the fading light, the same water his grandfather had fought to preserve. Jack felt the journal's weight in his pocket, its words alive in the air around him. "You were right," he murmured, as if William Mercer could hear him across the years. "We can't stop loss, but we can decide what survives." The sun dipped behind the hills, painting the sky with gold and rose. Jack looked at Maya, at Ruth, at Lila, at the herd grazing peacefully. He felt the fracture inside him at last begin to mend, not erased, but joined with something stronger. Rainmark lifted his head, ears forward, eyes bright. He looked not toward the wilderness this time, but toward the farm, the people, the future taking root in the soil. He had chosen to stay, and in staying, he had given them more than survival. He had given them a second chance. As the first stars pierced the twilight, the bells from town rang faintly, carried on the wind. Not as warning, not as defiance, this time as celebration. Jack closed his eyes and listened, his hand resting on the horse who had led him back to life. The valley was no longer just land. It was a foundation, built of horses and water, of memory and healing, of loss transformed into belonging. And in that quiet, Jack finally understood. Sometimes it takes a wounded horse to show a broken man the way home. If this story touched your heart, let me know by simply commenting 0 or 1 below. Your little comment tells me you're here, feeling the journey with me. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on the bell, because the next stories will carry you even deeper into the unbreakable bond between humans and animals. Sometimes the smallest choice, like typing a single number, can keep these stories alive.